morning. We're here for class 15 for Introduction to Judaism, RE204. This is the beginning of week 8, the final week of unit 2, where we close our discussion of Judaism in the Middle Ages. And we're closing today with what I've sort of categorized as pre-modernity, which is kind of a fudge on my part, because you'll notice some of the dates here are a bit late. But I've classified a series of sort of trends or revival movements in this period that are more consistent with medieval Judaism and sort of grow out of medieval Judaism rather than are real parts of the modern denominational diversity that we'll be looking at in Unit 3. So the topics we're covering today are better suited to Unit 2 than Unit 3, but they're all still very important to cover. So we're going to go through them today. You have 2 very short videos, but the majority of it is just going to be me talking at you, and I apologize for that. Okay, I'm Holly, or Dr. Pierce, as you prefer. My office hours are Thursdays at 4, so today, this afternoon, via Zoom, if you need to speak to me, if you want to go over material for the test that's coming up next week. If you can't make Thursdays at 4, you can email me questions, or you can email me to make an appointment if you can't make it today. Okay, so today we're going to look at some pre-modern innovations growing out of medieval Judaism. And then on class 16, next Tuesday, November 9th, I believe, we will be having the second test, the second unit test, yes, November 9th, at 12:30 to 1:50 p.m. here on my learning space. Remember, the tests are synchronous for this course, even though the rest of the content is asynchronous. So I do encourage you to show up on time at 12:30 on Tuesday to write your test. The test format is generally the same. It's exactly the same as the Unit 1 test, and Unit 3 test will be similar as well. Remember, your Unit 2 paper, which effectively serves as your essay question to end the term, is due on November 12th. You have basically everything you need now to write that paper, so you can go ahead and write that and submit it when you're ready. So for today, we're going to be looking at Kabbalah, we're going to be looking at the Musar movement, and we're going to be looking at Hasidism. So that's a lot, and I'm going to try to keep it basically simple and cursory, because each of these movements could be their own semester. So we're just going to cover the bare bones of these things, because they are very important innovations at the very end of the medieval period and into the modern period, and will still be influential when we look at the denominational splits coming up in Unit 3. And we will also be doing a brief Unit 2 review today, just to give you a structure, I guess, to hang your study on for Tuesday. Okay, so we are at this period into the Middle Ages of the Great Diaspora, and from many Jewish perspectives, the Great Exile that occurs in the Roman period and continues through the Middle Ages. This is largely, although there are periods of stability, there are periods and places of prosperity, generally speaking, the Jewish Middle Ages were a time of uncertainty, a time of no small amount of danger from political forces, from popular forces, from disease. The Middle Ages was an uncertain time in general. And this was largely a period of rabbinic Judaism. Although we have addressed religious diversity in the Middle Ages, and there is more religious diversity than a lot of people often discuss when they talk about the Jewish Middle Ages, if they talk about the Jewish Middle Ages at all. They tend to focus on the uniformity of it. And it's true, Rabbinic Judaism was the majority of Jews in the diaspora. Rabbinic Judaism was relatively stable and uniform. There were by far fewer sects in the Middle Ages than we see in the Second Temple period, for example, and we haven't yet reached the denominational variety that we see in the modern period. So the Middle Ages did have increased uniformity under Rabbinic Judaism. Now let's just pause for a moment and look at what are referred to as the Rabbinic Ages. And this is history, according to the rabbis, the history of Rabbinic Judaism. And remember, Rabbinic Judaism is rooted in the Mishnah, or the oral Torah. And according to Rabbinic tradition, the oral Torah was given to Moses at the same time as the written Torah. And oral Torah and written Torah are all Torah within Rabbinic Judaism. So rabbinic history effectively starts the same way as biblical history, with Abraham and Moses and the Exodus, and then it starts to get a little bit different. So Moses received the oral Torah, he passed it on to his successors, he passed it on to Joshua, who handed it off to the judges and the leaders of the community, and then comes the exile, the Babylonian exile, and according to rabbinic tradition, it is the scribes of Ezra's generation that really begins what they consider to be the roots of rabbinic Judaism, with the generation of the Sopharim, the scribes of Ezra's generations and earlier, those who recorded the law, those who recorded the oral law, or at least transmitted the oral law. So the Sopharim are essentially biblical, the biblical generations. The Zugot are the sages of the Second Temple period, the sages of the Sanhedrin, those who applied the oral law, many who I think historically we would refer to as the Pharisees. The Zugot were primarily Pharisees. Zugot means pairs, and remember when we talked about this, the sages often came in pairs, often a more liberal and more conservative voice, to use sort of clunky modern terms like Hillel and Shammai, who are the last great pairs of these generations. They not only transmitted the oral law, but they taught the oral law and they applied it in the Sanhedrin, in the religious courts. Next comes the Tanaim, or the Mishnaic generations. These are the generations that formalized the Mishnaic law and eventually wrote it down. So Ben Zakkai would be an example of the Tanaim. The Amoraim, the Talmud generations, these were the teachers. They codified the oral law, they taught it, and they started to formalize the way that it was taught. This generation is largely in Babylon, because it is obviously 70 CE was the fall of the temple, and by this point in the 200 to 500 we are in a state of diaspora, and these largely refer to the leaders of the Babylonian and Palestinian academies and the producers of the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. And this includes the Savaraim, who edited the Torah or the Talmud into the state in which it has been received since. Now we get into the Middle Ages, into the period that we're covering in this unit. The Geonim, the Goans, the heads of the Babylonian academies, in the beginning were sort of the leaders, religious leaders of the diaspora. Even Jews who lived outside of Babylon looked to the heads of the Babylonian academies for religious rulings, for answers to religious questions. So the Goans of the academy not only taught and led the academies and taught their students, but they also served as posics for the entirety of the Jewish world. And one of the big document productions of the Goanic generations was responsa, that is, letters responding to religious questions. So this period, that's the big productivity. And next come the Rishonim, the first ones, that is the rabbis after the Babylonian academies, the rabbis who were sort of in the wild, wild west of their various diasporic communities without so much reliance on the Babylonian academies, but before the Shulchan Aruch was published. So they really were at the forefront of creating minhag in these places, and it is their application of the law along with the explanation of the law given by previous generations and the texts given by previous generations that becomes codified in the Shulchan Aruch. And the Achronim are those who come, they're literally the later ones. So those rabbis that come after the Shulchan Aruch. Oh, by the way, the Rishonim also includes the Tosafists, or the people who wrote the Tosafot, the medieval commentaries on the Talmud. So they didn't write Talmud, but their commentaries are still included in Talmud. And the reason that this rabbinic history is important is not only because this tells us how rabbinic tradition itself views its own history, is because when rabbis are making determinations, oftentimes the generational placement of the authorities they're using will dictate the authenticity, the authority, the status of the authority they're dealing with. The Achronim, for example, cannot overrule a ruling made by an earlier generation unless he can find 2 or 3 different sources that back him up. Luckily, Rabbinic Judaism records a lot of dissenting opinion, so this is not impossible to do, but it does add, every generation has sort of an extra step of oversight that's required to question the rulings of previous generations. Because in Rabbinic Judaism, one of the reasons that minhag is so valued in Rabbinic Judaism is this notion that the earlier the generation, the closer to authentic that generation is. We have within Rabbinic Judaism this process for change and flexibility, but we also have an oversight situation in which earlier opinions can prevent change for change's sake, change that is inconsistent with tradition, change that is viewed as going against Jewish law. So it's sort of a give and take system that allows for change but requires continuity, I think is the best way to put it. Okay, so into the pre-modern era, the reason that I'm using this sort of term, the pre-modern, is because modernity doesn't hit everyone at the same time. It still doesn't hit everyone at the same time. Quite famously, if you're into digital humanities and cultural studies, you may have come across the idea that the future doesn't hit everyone at the same time. Neither does modernity. So even though we can say that as a historical period, modernity really starts with the advent of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment into the 1800s, Judaism is still in that period very much wrangling with the Middle Ages. There's no clean break between what is medieval and what is modern. So I'm using this term to really discuss those innovations that comes out of the Middle Ages, I guess. So we're going to look today at innovations that come after the Shulchan Aruch, but are not really part of the modern denominational movements. It's not really associated with emancipation, and those kinds of things that we will be dealing with in Unit 3. And one of the reasons that these movements belong in this unit is because they're really fed by the exhaustion of the Middle Ages, the exhaustion that we talked about in the previous class, that suffering, persecution, massacres, expulsions, the false Messiah movement under Shivatai Svi, these things kind of lead to something of a faith burnout in the Middle Ages. You can imagine how, if you've heard the term compassion fatigue going along in the pandemic. It's like that. It's faith fatigue. How long must we be faithful? How long can we keep up our faith given the suffering of the Middle Ages? And all of the movements I'm going to talk about today are effectively renewal movements or revival movements that are in response to the exhaustion of the Middle Ages. All of these movements also have significant continuity with Judaism of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, we have a solidification, a codification, a habituation, I guess, of the ways of the Talmud amongst rabbinic Jewish families and communities. And all of these movements that we're going to look at today share continuity with that habituation of halakha in the Middle Ages. And all of these count as continual growth or developments of rabbinic Judaism from the Middle Ages into the modern world, and they show sort of the absorption of philosophy, of ethics that we talked about last week, and also of mysticism, which we'll talk about today. And they also are the beginnings of diversification within rabbinic Judaism. Now, the ones we're going to be talking about today, for the most part, are not the same as the denominations we'll be talking about in Unit 3, but they are in many ways, they do fly in the face of the idea that medieval Judaism was all uniform, because they do show sort of different versionings of Judaism. And it's really sort of a foreshadow of what was to come. And this is not a surprise. The world was diversifying. The world was learning and changing its mind on lots of things at this period. So in this instance, it is truly pre-modern. It also is showing the signs of the modernity that is to come. And part of this was the development of the printing press in 1440. Remember, before this period, all Jewish books were handwritten. In 1440, after 1440, we get an explosion of Jewish literature that was published and therefore accessible to more than just a few people. And publishing activities explode in rabbinic Judaism in the late Middle Ages and into the pre-modern period. So it makes sense that we get a lot more diversification of opinion and through the more diverse publication of opinion. Now, one of the movements that is truly medieval that I do want to bring up because it hasn't come up before, and this is the Pietist movement. Now, there were already Christian Pietists, and in fact there were also Muslim Pietists. Piety effectively means the demonstration of religious virtue, but religious virtue not just for public sake, one that has a spiritual dimension to it. So Pietist movements focus on the spiritual growth of the individual through demonstrating and cultivating personal dedication, personal piety, a personally pious lifestyle. And within Christian Pietist movements, this largely focused on humility, austerity, thriftiness, discipline, meditation, prayer, acts of service, that kind of thing. And and the Jewish piety movement, particularly as it develops in the 12th and 13th century within Ashkenazi communities, shows this Christian influence. It emphasized personal holiness, a cultivation of personal spiritual holiness in ethics, in lifestyle, in community service. It emphasized good deeds. It emphasized kindness and generosity. It emphasized a personal devotion to God, not just as a ritual process, not just as identity, but also as a way to cultivate your own spirituality and to derive satisfaction out of a relationship with God that goes on to fuel things like visiting hospitals, helping the sick, giving generously to widows and orphans and things of that nature. So the piety movement was a spiritual movement. It's also a social movement, and one that was much needed, obviously, amongst the Ashkenazi, because times were kind of tough for the Ashkenazi in the Middle Ages. So piety movements focused on faiths and practices, but not ritual practices, communal practices. Let us move to a medieval and into pre-modern movement that focused on religious experiences, not just religious practices. And this is, of course, mysticism. Mysticism as a concept describes practices of any religion that emphasize spiritual experience over traditional ritual, over even traditional learning. And mysticism generally transcends or seeks to transcend average states of consciousness by accessing divine levels of consciousness. Oftentimes, mysticism will emphasize states of ecstasy or states of transportation, meditative states, altered states, sometimes with chemical use, other times through dance or movement, or sometimes through fasting, sometimes through meditation. And mysticism generally emphasizes the way that hidden knowledge or inspiration can be derived from these altered states. The concealed knowledge of the universe, which is sort of a Greek philosophical context and sort of the root of what we mean when we talk about the word mystery, concealed knowledge of the universe, is sort of the goal of most forms of mysticism. And in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim mysticism, this means as well that the goal is union with the divine, because it is in union with the divine that we know the hidden knowledge of the universe. So there's lots of Christian mysticism growing in the Middle Ages and into pre-modernity. There's lots of Islamic mysticism growing in the Middle Ages and into modernity. Obviously, the famous one being Sufi mysticism within Islam. And Judaism is not immune to this movement towards mysticism, possibly because the real world was hard to understand and often confusing and not very comforting. So mysticism was a way in which people could seek a union with the divine, a transcendence of their everyday reality, and a way to access greater things. So obviously we're going to focus on Jewish mysticism today. So Kabbalah is the blanket term that we generally apply to all forms of Jewish mysticism. And Jewish mysticism comes in a variety of forms. The one you're probably most familiar with is really Lurianic Kabbalah. That's the sort of the one that became dominant in the modern age, as founded by Isaac Luria of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And he is often considered to be the father of modern Kabbalah. But the roots of Kabbalah go much deeper than that. Kabbalah, the concepts of Kabbalah really start developing in the 10th and 11th centuries in the Middle Ages. Into the 12th century, we start getting the concepts that are most familiar to us in modern Kabbalah, particularly the Ein Sof, or that the essence of God, the infinite center power of God, which is essentially sort of unknowing, is so beyond human experience, but yet is something that humans should strive to access. The idea of the Ein Sof really comes from the 10th, 11th century, so it was already there before modern Kabbalah becomes a thing. The way that we know the Ein Sof is through the emanations that God chooses to share with us And the parts of God are revealed in numerous ways. And part of Kabbalistic practice is to be able to sensitize yourself to these emanations, to open yourself to these emanations, and eventually, hopefully, seek the Ein Sof, which is a sort of a state of enlightenment, to borrow a term from other religions. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts of something that most modern Kabbalah shares. Merkava mysticism is even older. This is ancient Second Temple Judaism territory, very early Judaism, very early Jewish mysticism. And that's centered on understanding, studying, memorizing, meditating upon, drawing inspiration from, experiencing those visions of God and heaven that are given to us in the ancient texts, those little glimpses, as a way to get to God. That's sort of the nuts and bolts. Merkava mysticism also focused on transcendental states and dream and transportation of the soul to the divine. It's all really complicated. If I were to talk more about this, then we'd never get anything else done. But it is important to understand that mysticism grows out of ancient tradition. It grows out of medieval concepts, and is, in many ways, the Kabbalah that we know it today is a product of the Middle Ages. Now, the sort of root text of Kabbalah in Judaism, modern Kabbalah, is the Zohar. This is a mystical commentary on the Torah that was originally contributed or attributed to a 2nd century rabbi by the name of Simeon ben Yochai, as well as others. And its publisher, the person who published it, Moses de Leon in the 13th century, a Spanish rabbi, effectively claimed to have translated hidden documents. That was this commentary on the Torah, this mystical commentary on the Torah. He never produced the originals for examination, and largely most people today believe that Moses de Leon simply wrote the Zohar. It doesn't change its status. It is a mystical commentary on Torah, but I'm certain Moses de Leon was looking at the ways in which the earlier generations had higher authority, and he might have enfolded some of the teachings of earlier rabbis in his translation, but it's quite probable that Moses de Leon actually produced the Zohar. But the Zohar is one of the major groundbreaking pieces of sacred text to come out of the Middle Ages. The reason I didn't necessarily include it in that original list with, of course, Torah and Tanakh, the Torah, the books of the law, and Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, the Mishnah, the oral Torah, Talmud, the commentary on the Mishnah, and the Shulchan Aruch being that big landmark codification of rabbinic Jewish law, the Zohar can be included on that list of sacred texts, because for Jews who practice Kabbalah, the Zohar is also Torah. So you have written Torah, you have oral Torah, and you have hidden Torah, the mystical Torah of the Zohar. So for many Jews, the Zohar is an important landmark addition to the sacred literature of Judaism. And for other Jews, it may not be considered Torah, but it is at least respected. And it was eventually absorbed into more mainstream versions of rabbinic Judaism, despite a lot of resistance to Kabbalah, because Kabbalah may seem like just this mystical practice of personal spirituality and meditation, but Kabbalah in the Middle Ages also had an intense practical aspect. Practical Kabbalah is essentially magic, healing, miracle working, the attempt, magic can be defined as an attempt by people to use supernatural means to control reality, and we see this in practical Kabbalah. The use of magic, the use of meditative states and charms and plants and so forth in order to affect reality, and to use the Zohar and passages from the Zohar to affect reality. This was something that was met with resistance amongst mainstream Judaism. It felt like witchcraft to many Jews. So Kabbalah became intensely popular throughout the late Middle Ages and into the modern era, and is still quite popular in some circles, but it also was intensely criticized by many as magic and potentially dangerous. And this is why within most rabbinic Jewish traditions that have absorbed Kabbalah, there are strict regulations surrounding who can study Kabbalah. Typically, within traditional rabbinic Judaism, you can only study Kabbalah after you have studied everything else. After you have grounded yourself in traditional Judaism, are you then allowed to undertake a study of Kabbalah, because there is a perceived danger surrounding Kabbalah. But it does mark a major landmark piece of literature coming out of this period. Okay, the other thing that Rabbinic Judaism absorbs through ancient world and into the Middle Ages is, of course, a preoccupation with ethics. Now, we've already described Judaism as ethical monotheism, which basically means there is a single God who is good and who also cares if I'm good. And this is really at the heart of the theology of Judaism. There is one God, God is good, and God wants me to be good. And Judaism is essentially the answer to the question, how do I be good in the way that God wants me to be good? So ethics is a central Jewish concern. It is at the core of Jewish life. It's not always easy to determine what is the right thing to do, what is the good thing to do. We, as humans, we have limited ability to see the future. We have limited ability to see the effects of the things we do. We have limited ability to really understand cause and effect when we are in the middle of things. So how do I do the right thing? How do I be right with God? How do I live in harmony with God and my fellow humans by doing the right thing? This is a lifetime question. We spend our whole lives trying to do the right thing. And within Judaism, if you love God, you want to do the right thing. That is how a love of God is expressed. In medieval times, this was perhaps even murkier. Hurt people, right? So in a world that is bleak, in a world that is traumatic, in a world that in which suffering and instability and uncertainty is common, in any sort of difficult world, how do I be good in a difficult world is an even more complicated question than just how do I be good. I kind of think that most of us can do good when everything's going good. But it becomes an even bigger question of how do we do good even when stuff gets hard. So it makes sense that the Musar tradition grows out of I'm not really sure why I capitalized that second S. Musar can be spelled M-U-S-A-R. It can sometimes be spelled M-U-S-S-A-R. These are all transliterations, so it's not always going to be transliterated in the right manner. Musar basically means instruction. It's particularly on ethics and morality. And it has its roots in very early medieval literature, because right from the get-go, particularly as soon as Judaism absorbed philosophy, But generally speaking, rabbis and scholars and regular Jewish people have been writing and thinking and talking about what it means to be good for a really long time. And later Musar tradition has its roots in the text Duties of the Heart. It's sort of one of the classics of the Musar tradition. Oftentimes when we talk about the Musar movement, we're talking about a movement that starts in the 19th century Lithuania, so really late into modern times. But Musar has its roots in the Middle Ages. So it is a focus on ethics, it's a focus on morality, sometimes piety. It also absorbs the piety movements, but it's also deeply psychological. I think the Musar movement in many ways shows a sensitivity to not only mental and emotional states, but also psychological states that is not really that common in the Middle Ages. And one of the ways that it sort of focuses on the producing of good mental health, of a good psychological state, is through encouraging Musar mindfulness. And this is the practice that attempts to understand the law as it applies to your personal mental and emotional and physical health, as well as to ritual. It is a way of understanding yourself and your body and your mind in relationship to the law. Musar takes with it sort of an ancient tradition that we find in Judaism of the Yetzers, the impulse to good, the Yetzer Tov, and the impulse towards bad, the Yetzer Ra, and that everyone has an impulse to do good and everyone has an impulse to do bad. And this makes up our subconscious motivations. We have to always seek to understand ourselves and understand, why am I doing this? Am I doing this out of an impulse to do good? Am I doing this out of an impulse to do bad? Am I doing this for selfish reasons? Is this the right thing to do? Or do I just want to believe it's the right thing to do because it's subconsciously what I want to do? So Musar has a really intricate understanding of human psychology in terms of the decisions we make. And it produces effectively a practice of mido, or measure, to balance our impulses to do good and our impulses to do bad through self-cultivation. And through self-cultivation, the cultivation of mido, or balance, and cultivation of the midos, or traits, that we find in Musar, that will allow us to balance our vices and our virtues, and hopefully eventually cultivate our virtues and decrease our vices once we explore them and bring them to light. They will fade away. So the whole of Musar is really about cultivating an ethical heart, an ethical mind, an ethical body, and having your heart and mind and body living in balance together. This is one of the things why I include Musar in this, even though it's probably not as famous as Kabbalah and Hasidism, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's my favorite. It's one of my favorite trends. Musar is not a separate movement in Judaism. Musar tradition is found in all forms of Judaism, and it sort of developed as a way to renew or revive Judaism at the end, or in response to the Middle Ages, but it's always been in Judaism and still remains in Judaism. The 19th century Lithuanian movement was essentially began by a rabbi, Salanter, who is a famous rabbi in the Ashkenazi tradition, who lived from 1810 to 1883. And he taught that we have to cultivate our humanity and our ethics, and ethics is the same as our humanity, over dedicated particularities, slavish devotion to the law, that it's more important to be human than to be ritually correct. And we have to have the courage, effectively, of being a mensch. We, and you've probably heard this term, be a mensch. It's really, mensch just means human. So to be a human is to be an ethical person. And to have these major traits of Musari, that is, to have courage, but at the same time to not be boastful, to speak up, but also have the ability to be quiet, to have humility, to be humble, to be to embrace simplicity, to trust and have faith. Faith in God, but also trust in your fellow humans, to have compassion that grows out of the loving kindness that God asks of us, to be generous as we can, to be patient with others, to be grateful when others are patient with us, to show gratitude for the things that you have, not greed for the things that you don't have. So all of these traits really echo sort of the traditional traits that people apply to God, particularly the loving kindness. So there is an element of attempting to follow God's paradigm, to attempt to be God-ish, God-like, to be more God-like, but the fact that Musar chose the word mensch, human, to describe these qualities is really central. This is not about trying to be God, it's trying to be as close to the attributes of God as you can while embracing your essential humanity. Menschhood, becoming human, is really a practice of becoming humane through ethical mindfulness, and the production of tikkun, the mending of the world. That loving kindness has the ability to heal the world, to heal each other, to heal ourselves. Now, this has a long tradition of being a personal practice, the searching of one's heart and mind to find all of the instances of malice and greed and fear and anger, and to seek those out, to resolve them for yourself, and therefore to multiply your goodness, your kindness, compassion, to learn what cruel impulses live within you so that you can control those cruel impulses and eventually reduce them or even manage to eradicate them. So it's a personal practice, but Salantar's innovation really makes it a communal practice that we can together help each other be a mensch, and that mensches are absolutely essential to communal health. So Salantar's great innovation really is teaching people that being humane, being kind, is a way that you can bring a lightness to yourself, but you can also bring a lightness to the people around you. And you can be the mensch that helps other people get through their hard times. And if you're lucky, you will meet up with mensches who help you get through your hard time. So Salantar really focuses not on the individual journey of the mensch, but the communal effects of the mensch, and that we have the ability to bring Musari, make Musari a communal affair. There's a very short video on the menschness, the state of menschhood, that I'm listing below if you want to sort of get a better feel for what it means to be a mensch. Okay, so now we move on to probably the most famous, tied with Kabbalah, probably the most famous late medieval, early modern innovation within Judaism, and this is, of course, the Hasidic movement. Hasidic Judaism today is often viewed as sort of a separate sect of Judaism, probably because media portrayals focus on Hasidic Haredi Jews or ultra-Orthodox Jews that are perceived as like sort of living separately from other Jews. And remember, a sect essentially is a group of Jews who, within Judaism, a sect is often described as a group of Jews who question the Jewishness of other Jews and focus on the rightness of their own version of Judaism. And there are Haredi Hasidic Jews today who do not only seek to live separately from non-Jews, but also seeks to live separately from non-Haredi Jews. And these are probably the most visible examples of Hasidic Jews today. The black clothing and the distinctive clothing and the distinctive way of life and the living in community separate from Gentiles and non-Jews. So we often think today of Hasidism as a sect of Judaism, but this is not the way it started. It started not as a separate movement, but as a revival movement amongst rabbinic Judaism of the Ashkenazi after the Middle Ages, in light sort of the exhaustion of the Middle Ages. It is a spiritual revival movement and a piety movement. But not exactly what you might have in mind when you think of a piety movement. So it didn't start out as a sect, and I would argue that Hasidism today is still a trend that runs through all the denominations of Judaism, and not all Hasidic Jews, not all Jews who connect with Hasidism are sectarians, okay? Even though we might be tempted to describe Hasidism as a sectarian split, it is not, or at least it was not meant to be. So when we come out of the exhaustion of the Middle Ages, Hasidism is essentially a renewal movement, a revival movement meant to revive spirituality, revived religious experience, revived religious faith, and passion against the backdrop of the despair in the Middle Ages, particularly against the despair of conversion. Because a lot of Jews in the Middle Ages were forced to convert. Many Jews chose to convert as a way to leave the suffering of being Jewish behind and to become a Christian, to access more freedoms and more stability and certainly more safety. Hasidism was designed as a way to give Jews a more passionate reason to remain Jewish. So Hasidism was started by a fellow who is just referred to generally as the Baal Shem Tov or the Besht. Baal Shem Tov means the master of the good name. And the Baal Shem Tov is distinctly different from a lot of the figures that we've talked about in this unit. He is not a great rabbi. He wasn't a child prodigy. He didn't found a yeshiva. He didn't write a bunch of books. He, in fact, didn't leave any books. He just left stories. He was probably literate, because one of the jobs that the Baal Shem Tov held in his life was he was a teacher at a cheder, or a Hebrew elementary school. He also was a laborer. He worked with lime and clay, making plaster for walls. He was also an innkeeper at one point in his life. But when he began his mission to bring this idea of this new way to cultivate a personal relationship with God, he became a traveling mystic, a traveling teacher, a miracle worker, a healer, someone who effectively worked in practical Kabbalistic magic. And eventually it was considered a saint. And he traveled throughout Poland, what is now Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. And he was opposed, I guess you could say, to what he saw was the joy-killing academic Judaism, that asceticism, that old-fashioned austere piety, that too much study under the strict supervision of a teacher leads to depression, not to joy. And it is joy that will keep Jews alive, that will keep Jews into Judaism, that will keep Jews from converting. And he taught that it is through joy that we seek the sparks of the divine in ourselves and in others and in all creation and everything around us. And it is through seeking these sparks of joy that we will eventually have an experience of the divine, because these sparks of joy are the sparks of the divine. And one of the things, because he was a traveler, he did not have an organization. He didn't have a center or a synagogue of his own. He was a traveling preacher. And he taught that Jews should actually worship everywhere, that all of creation belongs to God. All of creation has these sparks of the divine in it. All of creation is good. God said so in Genesis. When God made the world, he said it is good. And following Isaiah 6:13, the whole world is full of his glory. So therefore, Hasidic Jews are encouraged to worship everywhere. And this was kind of a revolutionary idea in the Middle Ages, because oftentimes it was actually pretty dangerous for Jews to worship anywhere except behind closed doors, in their homes or in their discreet synagogues, behind walls and locked doors. So worshiping everywhere was probably a scandalous thought for many of the Jews of the Middle Ages. Like, dude, you get yourself killed that way. In fact, you might get us all killed that way. So keep a low profile. The Baal Shem Tov was essentially had antinomialist traits. Antinomialism. Aside being an awesome word to help you win at Scrabble, effectively means anti-law. Now, I don't want to paint the Baal Shem Tov with this brush. It's not like he was out there eating ham and drinking a milkshake. It's not that he denied Jewish law, but that the overemphasis of law was the death of joy. And a story of his traveling. One day he came upon Jews, and they were upset because a young goat herder was whistling on Yom Kippur. And he effectively said, well, that young boy whistling out, walking in the joys of nature, is actually showing more joy than you downers in the synagogue fasting and feeling miserable. And it is the joy of the whistling goat herd that Judaism needs, not the sourness of you guys dressed all in black and having your long face and not enjoying life. So the Baal Shem Tov didn't leave books, but he left lots of stories of his life. And it is his teachings and his stories of his life that becomes the core of the Hasidic movement, which is essentially a spirituality movement, a revival movement, not an academic movement, not originally. So some of the central core concepts within Hasidism is the importance of hitlahavut. Hitlahavut essentially means enthusiasm. So the enthusiasm for Judaism, enthusiasm for life, enthusiasm for prayer, enthusiasm for whistling. So whatever you do it enthusiastically, and you do it with joy. And in fact, when it comes to religious activities, you do it not only with joy, but with ecstasy. To do with intensity, kavanah, the ecstatic intensity that comes. The desired worship, the worship that God desires, is not strict, lawful, dire behavior, but enthusiastic, joyful, ecstatic, enthusiastic, intense worship, such as we see with, David dancing in front of the ark. All my bones shall say, Lord, who is like you? From Psalm 35:10. All my bones. Within Hasidism is taken to refer to my bones dance because I feel the intensity of God. So Hasidic worship was loud and chaotic. We already talked about Jewish worship in the Middle Ages was a lot more loud and chaotic than it is now, with no central leader to prayer, and Jews just stood in the synagogues and often just prayed out of sync, and it was often a really loud, cacophonous experience. But for Hasids, music and dance and singing and prayer could not simply be contained within a synagogue because it was often too loud and boisterous. So this was perhaps a little bit much for other Jews to take. It was often considered the Hasidics looked drunk and were potentially like mad or dangerous because the worship was required intensity, enthusiasm, and joy, ecstasy within your religious devotions. Love of God, love of Israel, love of Torah, and love of the tzaddikim, or the saints of Judaism. God desires the whole heart, according to the Talmud. And in Hasidism, it is understood that means that whole heart means to love. So you love God, you love Israel, you love Torah, you love the saints, you love each other, you love yourself. And this is the root not only of joy, but of proper worship. So after, and in fact, love, the amount of love you had, according to the Besht, it's more important that you have love in your heart than you have a sophisticated Talmud education. God sees the love. He can appreciate the Talmud education, perhaps, but if that Talmud education is without joy, then it's worthless compared to love and joy in your heart. And this was another thing that many Jews had a major problem with Hasidism, the placing of the heart over the mind, the faith over the intellect. This was not the way Rabbinic Judaism had developed. Rabbinic Judaism developed out of this understanding that it is through study that Jews survive. It is through study that Jews preserve the text. It is through study that Jews fulfill the covenant. So Hasidism met with significant resistance because to non-Hasidic Jews, it looked like they were promoting faith and love over education. Hasidism was not necessarily ever opposed to study. It simply the Besht simply stated that love and joy is what God wants to see, and study is merely an accessory and doesn't mean anything if you don't have that love and joy. So after the Besht, he was succeeded by a fellow by the name of Dov Ber, who brought it in from a traveling mission, I guess, to an established mission. And he started to establish Hasidic centers, Hasidic community centers, Hasidic leaders in places where people could come to you and talk about their problems. And one of the things that the Hasidic centers focused on was offering spiritual guidance, spiritual advice, spiritual support, not simply religious, academic type explanations. After the Besht, we start to see Hasidic texts be produced, like the Tanya. The Tanya is sort of, for many Hasidics, it is also a sacred text of Judaism, and this is a text of Hasidic mysticism, but it brings mysticism into the everyday. It's a text of mysticism for everyday Hasidic life. And there's also the development of Chabad, which you may actually already be familiar with. Chabad stands for, it's acrostic like many things in Judaism. CH, the B, and the D are the important bits. Chabad, Chochmah, wisdom for the CH, B, Binah for understanding, and D for Da'at. So which means knowledge. So wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So after the Besht, Hasidism really makes its peace with education and starts to develop through Chabad an emphasis on the whole brain awakening and being applied to the law at the same time as the heart. So it brings the mind, the intellect, back into Hasidic Judaism instead of just emphasizing the heart, but they are linked. It's engaged, spiritualized intellect. And this was probably largely in response to the resistance that Hasidism was met with, particularly its dispute with the Mitnagdim. Mitnagdim means the opposers, but and they opposed Hasids, and many Hasids were given the harim, or the excommunication, the ban by Mitnagdim leaders. But the Mitnagdim were not simply the bad guys in the Hasidic story. In fact, it is with the Mitnagdim that we need to move on now, because it is the Mitnagdim that kind of gives us the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, particularly the Vilna Gaon. You may have even heard of this guy before. He's pretty famous. And he was one of the major leaders to the Hasidic movement. So it's hard to know who to root for here, because the Baal Shem Tov is considered a good guy and he's pretty famous, and the Vilna Gaon is considered a good guy and he's pretty famous. Here, look, the secret here is none of these guys are the bad guys. They just have different visions, and both of them want to fulfill the covenant in the way that they see fit. So this is not abnormal for Rabbinic Judaism. We often have people who disagree within Rabbinic Judaism. It's all considered valid. Just because people oppose don't necessarily mean that one guy is the good guy and one guy is the bad guy. You understand? So the Vilna Gaon, called Gaon not because he was a leader of a Babylonian academy. The Vilna Gaon received the term Gaon as an honorary title, because Gaon means genius. And the Vilna Gaon was a genius. Like, he was literally a child prodigy genius, the memorizing 6 pages of Talmud a week at the age of 5 kind of genius. So he got the name Gaon because he was considered to be a genius, which does increase his authority in Rabbinic Judaism, right? Like, Rabbinic Judaism often is a meritocracy. That means those with the best chops, those who know the Talmud best, are often the ones that are considered the most authoritative. So being smart is pretty important within Rabbinic Judaism. He opposed Hasidism for many of the same reasons many Jews opposed Hasidism. That their worship, the style, the timing, the noise of Hasidic worship was unseemly, and it was showy, and it was potentially dangerous to the Jewish communities because of this. And it showed a lack of modesty. It was kind of drunk, and there was flailing of limbs, and it was considered unmodest. And modesty in Judaism is a requirement for both men and women within Judaism. So modesty was a problem here. Secondly, they worried about an element of pantheism in Hasidism, that God is in everything, in rocks and trees. For them, that got dangerously close to pantheism, and was seen as a threat to the strict monotheism of Judaism. Third, the slaughter controversy. The Hasidic Jews slaughtered their animals differently, and for a while, Jews belonging to the Mitnagdim and Jews belonging to the Hasidic movement couldn't actually eat together. And as we've seen before, Jews who can't eat together have problems seeing eye to eye. This went the other way. Hasidic Jews forbade Hasidic Jews from eating with Mitnagdim because the Hasidic Jews felt that the Mitnagdim were not slaughtering their animals correctly. So it goes both ways here. And fourth, the Mitnagdim would not compromise on their belief that education and discipline was at the core of Jewish survival. That yes, joy and faith, those things are very nice, and I've already talked about the way Rabbinic Judaism encourages Jews to take the simple pleasures in life. But the Mitnagdim hit hard, like Hebrew education, Torah education, Talmud education, the discipline to be a Jew is how Jews will survive. And they worried that Hasidism was downplaying the importance of education and discipline. And fifth, and this was the Vilna Gaon's big thing, in the aftermath of Sabbatai Zvi and all of the fallout from that, he simply thought that the emphasis on the saints of the Hasidic movement was dangerous. It was cult-like. It let room for the rising of false messiahs, and it could potentially also be a threat to monotheism. If it developed into a personality cult, he worried that Hasidics would start worshiping their leaders. He worried that too much divinity was being attributed to these saints, and he also just felt that the Tzaddikim were only as safe as the personal characteristics of each Tzaddikim. So if there arose a saint, quote unquote, or someone who was recognized as a saint who was essentially a bad guy, that could be really dangerous. So the Mitnagdim, including the Vilna Gaon, had 5 different major criticisms of Hasidism. And for a really long time, Hasidics were ostracized from mainstream Judaism. But again, before you start thinking that the Vilna Gaon is the bad guy in this situation, the classical yeshiva tradition, the roots of modern Orthodoxy, the classic Ashkenazi minhag, this is the Mitnagdim. Mitnagdim becomes the foundation for later Orthodoxy. The minhag chagra is the way people refer to as the customs of the gra, is the gold standard of Ashkenazi minhag. So again, this is very complex. This is not a situation of a group rises up and opposes the good guys and then that group fades away. Both of these groups, the Hasidic movement and the Mitnagdim, go on to become the core of what is Orthodoxy in Judaism today. So this dispute is a schism of sorts. Different rituals led to separation, even though the Besht didn't intend to create a separate movement. It devolved into 2 separate movements and two opposing viewpoints. But this wasn't permanent. By the mid-1800s, when faced with the Reformation, the Jewish Reformation, when faced with Reform Judaism, or what would become Reform Judaism, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, Hasidism and the Mitnagdim mended their fences and came together and become the core of what is later Orthodoxy. So there is a temporary schism, but when faced with a mutual enemy, I guess, and the denominations start rolling out, the Mitnagdim and the Hasidism come back together. Okay, so I am running out of time. But luckily, that's the end of the new material for Unit 2. So we are in a state here that what we've looked at in this unit of diaspora, in which the Babylonian communities, the Babylonian, that's a map of Hasidism. So in a state of diaspora with the Babylonian communities, sort of riding point, I guess you will, if you will, in early periods, and then later moving on to the individual rabbis, individual yeshivas, it is a period of mobility. It's a period of not denominations and not really sects, and not much in terms of schisms. There is diversity through the spread of Judaism, and there's diversity in terms of the cultural expressions of Judaism, but for the most part, in the Middle Ages, the diaspora is exceptionally uniform for Jews. But there is suffering and persecution in the Middle Ages, and this leads to a certain level of exhaustion, which leads to renewal and revival movements, which foreshadows the splits that we will see in Judaism in Unit 3. There is emphasis on community and pro-social behaviors within Judaism, because it was hard times and people needed to help each other survive it. And this is what Israel means for Jews in the Middle Ages, is community. There is also, of course, emphasis on God and Torah education. There's also an increasing emphasis on personal faith, personal spirituality, as we see in the expressions of piety, musar, and mysticism. And there is a certain level of disintegration of cogency as we move into the modern era, perhaps foreshadowed by the split between the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. Even though they managed to mend their fences, they mended their fences in opposition to other Jews who had different visions of Judaism in the modern era. So that's really where we are within Judaism. This unit we covered 1,000 years, so it went much slower pace than Unit 1, which covered like 3,000 years. so we're slowing down, and in fact in Unit 3 I think we only cover a couple of 100 years, so we really slow down in Unit 3. Okay, so we have the diaspora, we have the differences of geography and influences and contexts throughout the, the known world of the time. We have the continued development of Rabbinic Judaism and the diversities that grow out of the cultural bereichs of this period, particularly the Ashkenazi, the Sephardim, and the Mizrahi. And we have the different histories growing out of this period, the different forms of persecution, and unfortunately, in this period, we also have the development of anti-Semitism, which sadly, obviously, will follow Jews into Unit 3 in a major way. So there is truth to the idea of the age of cogency. The Middle Ages, in terms of Judaism, particularly Rabbinic Judaism, is relatively uniform, stable, and unified compared to what we saw in the Second Temple period and what we see in Unit 3. The majority of Jews were Rabbinic Jews, but don't forget, non-Rabbinic Judaism exists throughout this period and exists still. There is cogency, but there is also diversity in this period. This is the period in which many Jews lived under rabbinic authority. Either we can call it autonomous or we can call it isolated, your choice. There are both pros and cons to the isolation, alienation seen in the Middle Ages. And this is a period in which Rabbinic Judaism becomes habitual within many Jewish families. Which becomes really important in Unit 3 when family traditions start coming up against modernity. It is also, still a period of diversity. Geographic dispersal led to not only widespread far-flung places like we see in Africa and China and Asia, but it also begins the sort of different versions of Judaism as we see in the culture bereichs. These are not denominations, all right? Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews were all rabbinic Jews and practiced essentially the same Judaism. These are not denominations. What they are is cultural varieties. flavors of cultural expression, the way Judaism was lived in these different geographic locations, with the Ashkenazi Jews living in colder climates surrounded by Christians, influenced by Christianity, and Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews generally living in warmer places and more heavily influenced by their Islamic contexts than Christianity, although the Sephardim experience both Islamic and Christian rules, as we saw when we looked at their week. It's not very tidy. As you can see here, we have Sephardim growing out of Spain, but we also have Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and in fact the UK, that is largely influenced by Sephardic movement. As Sephardim were expelled from Spain, many went into Amsterdam and into the UK and into the Americas. We have groups like the Italkim in Italy that don't consider themselves either Sephardic or Ashkenazi because they predate the foundings of the Shum or the Golden Age. So it's not very tidy. It's the best we can do to sort of give you a frame to hang the Middle Ages on and to hang cultural variety on. Okay, so the Judaism of the Middle Ages. There are definitely elements of continuity with ancient Judaism. The central pillars of ancient Judaism remain as established by Ezra. Emphasis on the Bible, emphasis on prayer, emphasis on Hebrew, emphasis on family, emphasis on rejecting intermarriage, emphasis on Shulchan Aruch and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and people essentially learning how to apply the law for themselves from their authorities. And it is a period of general autonomy in ghettos, in shtetls, in the millet system. In many cases, many Jews, actually, the authorities they dealt with on a daily basis was a Jewish authority. Many Jews lived their whole lives without really having a lot of contact with the non-Jewish authority because of the ghetto system. Most Jews in the Middle Ages probably lived their whole lives hoping they didn't have to have any contact with the non-Jewish authority in the Middle Ages. And the cornerstones of rabbinic Jewish practices are familiar echoes of what we see in ancient Judaism and are probably familiar to you from the Judaism of today. So prayer, study, the emphasis on Hebrew, the emphasis on feasts and fasts, both communal rituals and domestic rituals, an emphasis on sharing memory and story as a main vehicle for Jewish, not only Jewish identity, but Jewish religiosity and shared origins, an emphasis on keeping kosher and keeping the Sabbath as cornerstones of Jewish identity, and a blend of the synagogue and the home as being sort of the main centers of Judaism and Jewish life. And of course, all of the familiar elements of the life cycle that we see in Judaism today, rituals of marriage, birth, and death. Most of those kinds of rituals really formed in the Middle Ages. So our Unit 2 really focused on a lot of the cogency of Rabbinic Judaism in this period, but also in the diversity that develops, and particularly into the late Middle Ages when we looked at the diversification of Judaism. None of these are quite denominational splits, though. That we'll save for Unit 3. Most of these are not sectarian splits, although the Mitnagdim and Hasidic controversy does come close to that. It's important to notice sort of the progression of prosperity and suffering, and the way that the give and take between prosperity or stability and suffering kind of creates this exhaustion by the end of the Middle Ages that really inspires these later movements of the late Middle Ages. So in week 5, this was our week we spent on diaspora. Looking at the material culture of the diaspora, looking at the diversity of the diaspora and the cogency of the diaspora. Then we spent week 6 on the Ashkenazi, looking at the history from the Shum settlements to the Pale of Settlement to the east, looking at Jewish charters, looking at the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and then looking at some of the Ashkenazi religious activities going on, particularly Rashi. And then we spent a week on the Sephardim, Judaism under Islam, and we briefly looked at Islam and the similarities between Judaism and Islam. We spent a lot of time looking at Spain and the Golden Age of Spain and the Ottoman Empire. Those were the two big examples that we looked at. We specifically looked at Messianism and the Middle Ages, particularly with Shabbatai Zvi and this exhaustion at the end of the Middle Ages, and Maimonides, particularly his relationship with Jewish philosophy, how he stands as an example of Sephardic Jewry, and the 13 Principles was the thing of his that I asked you to read. And today we looked at the innovations of the late Middle Ages and into the modern period. Okay, so that was our very quick review. If you have any questions for that, if you missed any of that, go back and do the readings, watch the lectures, email me if you have any holes in your notes, and I will do what I can. But it should all be there for you in the lectures. I have no concerns. You guys did very well on the first test, like extraordinarily well on the first test. So I don't have much by way of concerns that this test won't be done well as well. Okay, so the test takes the whole 80 minutes from 12:30 to 1:50 on November 3rd. That's a Tuesday. Please show up on time. The test will consist of 75 multiple choice questions, so it covers the whole of Unit 2, the required readings, including the primary texts, the required AV that I played for you and that I asked you to watch, and the lectures. There are no aids allowed. Don't cheat. Work alone. Only use the device you're writing on, please. And I have done away with webcam surveillance, so this is the honor system, but it's time to be a mensch and not cheat on this test, please and thank you. Okay, your discussion forum post for this week is to summarize and discuss one required reading from this unit to help your classmates prepare for the Unit 2 test. And I encourage you to not only post, but to read the posts of others, because it may help you on the test. I may do, I think there will probably be more questions on the readings in this test than on the last test, because the readings were a bit more helpful. In many ways. There were some questions on the readings in the first unit test. There will be some questions certainly on this test from the readings as well. And remember, your Unit 2 paper is due. The instructions are on my learning space. If you haven't looked at them yet, you should look at them now and start working on it, because working on the test will also help you, or working on the paper will also help you prepare for the test, okay? If you have any comments or questions, please email me and let me know. Read the feedback that you got on your first unit paper, and consider how you can use the feedback to improve your second paper. Do remember to edit, proof, write your paper carefully. That's the big value of this being a paper and not just an essay question on the test, is that you actually have the ability to cite, use sources, include a work cited, edit, proof appropriately, that kind of thing. Be clear, be concise, write, and communicate carefully. Okay, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, please let me know. If you want to talk about the subject matter of this unit with your classmates, there's a discussion forum on my learning space where you can do that. You can come see me today at 4 for Zoom office hours if you need me. There's lots of opportunity for you to connect with others if you want help studying or if you have questions, okay? Including myself. Anytime you want to email me, please. Okay, that's it for now. Have a great weekend. Study, but also, sleep and eat and all of those good things. Remember, it's flu season, so take appropriate care of yourself, and I will see you here on Tuesday at 12:30 for our Unit 2 test. Wow, the term is going fast. Take care. Have a great weekend. Bye for now.